Welcome to the Campus Energy and Sustainability Podcast. In each episode, we'll talk with leading campus professionals, thought leaders, engineers, and innovators addressing the unique challenges and opportunities facing higher ed and corporate campuses. Our discussions will range from energy conservation and efficiency to planning and finance, from building science to social science, from energy systems to food systems. We hope you're ready to learn, share, and ultimately accelerate your institution toward solutions. I'm your host, Dave Carlscott. I'm a Director of Energy and Utility Advisory Services at Brailsford & Dunleavy.
We did have our first meeting with Eversource Gas to discuss this challenge, and we proposed immediately that we seek solutions together, that we find some common ground. And we did that centered around our children. We basically walked into a corporate boardroom with the president of a gas company and sat down and said, I have 3 children and I'm concerned about their future. And we got a very generous, thoughtful reply back.
If you think of the gas system as a tree with its branches spread out across the state, then if you want to bring a tree down, you don't, especially if it's in a dense area, you don't cut it off at the trunk and call out timber. That would result in disaster. But instead, you prune it back, starting at the edges.
In this episode, I talk with Zeyneb Magavi and Audrey Schulman, the co-executive directors of the Home Energy Efficiency Team, or HEET. Both women entered the climate change fight as mothers concerned about the future for their children. We begin with the history of their work on fixing super-emitting natural gas leaks in their neighborhood and across the state of Massachusetts. They share the story of building relationships with natural gas utility executives in order to make meaningful reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. From there, we talk through their next major challenge. What is the role of a natural gas system in a world that needs to eliminate the use of fossil fuels? We discuss HEET's role in developing the GeoMicroDistrict, a neighborhood-scale renewable energy network for heating and cooling buildings. We discuss the technology, but also how the alternative business model offers a cost-effective path forward for our utility companies and their workers as we replace our aging natural gas infrastructure. Regular listeners will hear echoes of episode 25 when we talked with Carleton College about a similar approach on their campus. I really enjoyed talking with these smart, innovative, and passionate leaders who are combining the power of motherhood, science, and creativity to map out a better world for all of us. I hope you enjoy this interview recorded July 1st, 2020. Well, Zeyneb and Audrey, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really happy to be here to talk.
Great. Well, we have a lot of ground to cover today. Let's start with some personal background, and then we can get into the work you're doing at HEET, where you are both the co-executive directors, if I have your titles right, and we'll see where we go from there. So Zeyneb, let's start with you. I know you and I met a few years back at Leith Sharp's Harvard Sustainability Leadership course, and I distinctly remember you presenting in that coveted right after lunch slot. I think I was a bit sleepy and maybe a bit skeptical about what you were going to present on. And you started talking something about activist moms and natural gas leaks, which got my interest. And then by the end, I think I was standing, shaking off my food coma in a standing ovation at the end of your presentation. So I know since that presentation, your story has evolved a little bit, but I'd like to give our listeners a little bit of that history. And then I know since then I've learned that Audrey was actually a part of that story, so maybe you can pass the baton to her when it makes sense. So can you start just by introducing yourself and we'll go from there?
Absolutely. So I'm here today with you as a co-executive director of HEET. My name is Zeyneb Magavi, but this all began quite a few years ago, and it began because I'm a mother. I have 3 children, and I used to work in global health and public health, and I was concerned about their exposures in terms of health in the home, the usual toxins in the baby bottle questions, and became fairly active in making sure that they were safe as a mother out of care to them, but became increasingly concerned that I couldn't keep them safe from climate change. And that was, the mega problem, the mega threat to their future. And I had a neighbor, Audrey, who also had 2 kids and was concerned about this. Over the years, we each kind of found our own path towards doing something about it to protect our kids. I got involved in the gas leaks world very unplanned and not on my life to-do list, by getting involved in Mothers Out Front, which is a grassroots organization that began here in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, and is now national, of mothers, grandmothers, and allies mobilizing for a livable climate from their kids across all boundaries, just out of love and protection for the children of this world. And so we took on the question of gas leaks because there had been recent publications showing the enormous amount of methane and how powerful that was as a climate change accelerator being leaked from the gas leaks in the streets. Audrey, my previous neighbor, was already involved in gas leaks at that point, and so we reconnected, this time sharing the work, and it's been quite a ride since. I want to just pass the conversation to Audrey for her to tell that background story of how she became involved.
Thank you. So I'm Audrey Schulman. I'm that other co-executive director. And I also started because of my children. I'd always been worried about climate change, but it seemed far in the future until I gave birth to my first child in the year 2000. And him being born in 2000 made it all too easy to be able to predict how old he would be when each of the scientific predictions became true in 2030 when he'd be 30, in 2050 when he'd be 50, etc. And it became very personal to me because of this. It became a threat. Like I was supposed to save for his college, but I wasn't supposed to do something to ensure that he had a livable planet to be on. So I joined with a group of neighbors to help to start HEET, which started off as teaching energy efficiency skills and tasks to different neighbors in, homes, so they'd be able to do that work in their own home. But after a while, we've always been innovative and into learning and always been hungry to get more and more emissions now. So we kept iterating and getting bigger and bigger chunks of emissions until we discovered natural gas, which is the mother lode of emissions because it is such a powerful greenhouse gas.
So if I understand it correctly, you started on energy efficiency, but then got into the leaks because the leaks themselves are, 28 times more powerful than in a short-term period. Is that right?
I think it's over 80 times more powerful over the first 20 years in which it's released
According
into the
to the
atmosphere.
IPCC, it's 84 to 86 times carbon dioxide in the first 20 years in the atmosphere, unburned natural gas or methane.
Got it. So that's some leverage right there.
Serious leverage, yes.
So you started on the leaks,
Yeah.
and then tell us, how did you go after the leaks? What was that process?
So there's an enormous number of gas leaks in Massachusetts, generally something over 16,000 unrepaired leaks as reported by the utilities each year. And there's no way that we can get them to fix them all now. But there was a great scientific study by Boston University showing that just 7% of all the gas leaks out there were basically gushing out gas way faster than all the others and emitted fully half of all the gas by volume. So as soon as we heard that, we thought, right, let's fix those first. That's the fastest, least expensive method to cut the emissions. Zeynep, do you want to take the next step?
Backing up for a minute, part of how we got the leverage to fix those gas leaks first started with the Mothers Out Front Cambridge team that I had joined. We had the leak maps that Audrey had created on Google and made public, and we decided to make this invisible problem visible, that was the challenge. And so we spent a weekend in May across Cambridge putting signs on every single gas leak to really bring the problem into people's streets and neighborhoods near their homes and businesses and schools. And it had an enormous amount of impact. We got a large amount of attention. And the idea spread, and other teams of Mothers Out Front and other climate activists began quote, tagging the gas leaks in towns across the state. There were forums that spread the information about the impact on climate and also on trees, on your pocketbook because we're paying for the lost gas, on this hazard of explosive gas leaking in your neighborhood. And that built a movement. And with that movement, the scientific finding of, just a handful of the leaks were leaking half of the methane, it became a policy opportunity. And within months of the publication of that finding, we were able to pass a law in Massachusetts that required gas utilities to prioritize the repair of those environmentally significant leaks.
So basically you used like a piece of paper and a stapler and next to the lost kitten sign, you had there's a gas leak here, maybe you should care about it. And the next thing you know, you changed state law. Is that maybe a little oversimplification?
It's a little oversimplification because we did make them waterproof and multicolored, but
okay,
yes,
fair enough.
Yes, you got it.
And also, Zeyneb very carefully checked with all the city councilors and the fire chief, et cetera, beforehand about the messaging to make sure that, that everybody was on board. And that's one of the many things we do, which is to check with everybody to make sure that we are finding common ground rather than alienating people.
Well, so talk about that. How did the gas companies respond to this? Because I can't imagine, in one hand, they don't want to leak gas because it's their product, but at the same time, having a bunch of mothers putting signs up about their leaks is probably not very endearing.
We did go out and check with everybody we had access to, like Audrey just mentioned, every city councilor, every relevant person in the town before tagging these leaks. The one group we didn't have access to was Eversource Gas, the company that provides gas in this area. We did reach out to them, but we didn't get a fast reply or a meeting immediately. In retrospect, we now understand that the tagging of the leaks was really a direct gut punch to the utilities, that they have a lot of concern for their public image, that this was a really serious thing for them.
Especially when done by moms and little kids. It's like the publicity was so darn cute.
Yes, we did have the cutest publicity ever. So in time, after this law was passed, and remember the speed between these actions and getting the law passed was extraordinary, just a few months. And within a couple months after that, after a number of letters from grandmothers in Cambridge, we did have our first meeting with Eversource Gas to discuss this challenge. And we proposed immediately that we seek solutions together, that we find some common ground. And we did that centered around our children. We basically walked into a corporate boardroom with the president of a gas company and sat down and said, well, we introduced this podcast I have 3 children and I'm concerned about their future. And we got a very generous, thoughtful reply back where the president said, I have 3 children too, and I care about their future too. And so we immediately found that common ground and began to attempt to find a way to work together towards a solution. And I'm not going to say that was an easy thing for either side, but in the end, we were able to move forward with a study to learn how to find those largest leaks most cost effectively and efficiently.
Because the utilities up until then had always had to worry only about safety and not emissions. So they didn't have an easy method of figuring out which of the many leaks were the super-emitting ones.
So super-emitting in the sense of climate change is not the same as going to blow up your neighborhood necessarily?
Exactly.
Yes, gas has to build up in a contained area in order to become explosive, so potentially explosive. So if it's, you got a gas leak out in the middle of the street, it can emit all at once. It's not going to build up into an explosive amount. And the utilities up until now did not have to repair those leaks.
Got it.
So gas utilities are, very reasonably very slow to change, cautious entities and fairly risk averse. So the shift in thinking from this focus on explosion hazard to explosion hazard and climate hazard was fairly profound for them. And it took, I would say, more than a year of conversations and engagement to really, for that to sink in as a actionable item for them. The opportunity, however, we could not do this kind of research or move forward in identifying these leaks without them, however. And we didn't have, for example, gas utility trucks or training or,
Right.
or compressors. So their willingness to allow us to go out with the trucks and do this research. HEET was the entity funding the research. I was a research lead. And this is where Audrey and I began to work together more intensely than before. And I had the opportunity to go out on the truck with the gas utility guys and spend hours and hours in the hot sun day after day for a whole summer. And I learned so much from them in so many different ways.
So if I understand it correctly, based on what you told me in the first presentation, the HEET actually developed some new ways of detecting leaks like this? Because like you said, the gas company didn't have equipment to detect them in this small a quantity, or what? Tell me more about that.
It's not that they could have devices to be able to find where the gas leaks are and to figure out whether it's potentially to the level of explosion. But they didn't have any method with which to figure out which ones were emitting the most amount of gas. So what we did is we tried out a variety of methods that might help them identify the biggest gas leaks so they could get fixed. And Zeyneb did all the research and came up with a variety of different methods, and we showed how effective each one was. The winning one was created by Bob Ackley, who's of Gas Safety Inc., or suggested by him, which is basically the concept that a big gas leak underneath the ground is going to push gas out further and further and further through the ground. And so that by measuring basically the surface area of gas-saturated soil over a leak is a great proxy for how much gas is being emitted.
Very cool.
And so if it's over 2,000 square feet,
that threshold is still evolving. But what we did is we took the same kind of sensing, talking to everyone, every expert, and collecting ideas, and then we picked out what we thought were the 5 or 6 most relevant and tested all of them against a very labor-intensive, scientifically correct method that would never actually work in the field, but the chamber method. And we also, in the process, there was a gap of, and we did collectively invent something called the flux bar, which was, and still is, a direct measurement at the time of repair. And so that became also part of our agreement with the gas companies at the end of this research as to how we would move forward together. We call that the shared action plan. And we basically negotiated with them, okay, we have this shared knowledge that we've created together, this data that we're not disputing. So we're from that ground, how are we going to best move forward? And we did a large summit at MIT with 300 people, including gas utility executives and climate activists.
The presidents of the 3 big gas companies in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Eversource, and remind me who those are.
And Columbia Gas and National Grid.
Okay.
And also their largest opponents, including folks who, had laid down in gas pipelines, etc., were all in the room together. And there were no fistfights, which was fabulous. And we also announced this shared action plan, which agreed to the leak extent method that we'd found to be most cost-effective and efficient at identification. Agreed to HEET verifying and reassessing together with the utilities over the coming years, and agreed to using this flux bar as a secondary verification method.
And transparency and, data transparency so that everybody could see the results.
And one of maybe the most amazing things was after this, we submitted this shared action plan to our Department of Public Utility together with the utilities. And in time, at a Department of Public Utility pays, it has become regulation in the state of Massachusetts. But even before it was enacted as regulation, the utilities began doing it in the streets. And so that agreement that has no lawyers, no money, it held even without regulation or requirement. And now it is actually Massachusetts law.
Basically, you gave them a different way of running their business that was, I would imagine, paid for itself, right? I mean, if they can stop leaking gas,
Yes.
especially the big leaks, it actually costs more in gas lost or lost revenue than it would in the cost to deal with it.
Yes.
With utilities, they get to pass the cost of the lost gas onto consumers.
Oh, so it's kind of a wash either way, huh?
Right, but for consumers, it is a fast ROI.
It is cost
Right.
effective, yes. The utilities don't have the strong incentive to do that, but yes.
Got it. Yeah, we should do a different podcast on how utility business models work, because that's a topic unto
Fascinating.
itself, but
Oh my goodness, yes.
not limited to gas companies. But so we start with a Lost Kitty poster that actually talks about gas leaks, and then it turns into state law with the support of the gas companies. So far, so good. Where do you go from here? You fix the gas leaks? I guess we're not done yet.
You would think we were done, but we were definitely not done.
From this work, we'd created real relationships with the presidents of those 3 different gas companies that are have 95% of the gas customers in the state. And we figured for the first time that we had the opportunity to do something really big.
Well, also we created real relationships with the workers on the trucks.
Yep.
And we started
And
to
the
care for their
regulators
future.
and the press. And, we had an opportunity here. And so one of the people that we work with is Professor Nathan Phillips from BU. He's a tree physiologist. And he said, if you think of the gas system as a tree with its branches spread out across the state, then if you want to bring a tree down, you don't, especially if it's in a dense area, you don't cut it off at the trunk and call out timber. That would result in disaster. But instead, you prune it back, starting at the edges, and bring it down in stages. So we looked at in Massachusetts, the utilities are currently replacing about 25% of the gas pipes underneath the street. And so I did an analysis of that and found how much they would be spending just at the current rate per mile times the number of miles left to do, with none of the money going back to the investor or any sort of escalator in cost. It is over $9 billion, which is more money than the current system in the ground is worth in its depreciated state. And we thought that's a ridiculous thing to be spending money on, because we have an emissions mandate in this state to reduce our emissions 80% by 2050. These gas pipes will not be used for their lifetime, how long they should be used. And also, given the current rate at which we're paying back for these pipes, the customers are paying back the money for these new pipes, these new fossil fuel infrastructure, we will not pay it off for 100 years. So that means our children and our grandchildren will be paying for fossil fuel infrastructure that they know they will not use. And it's just crazy. So, Zeynep, go ahead.
So we went into the next stage of this work with a set of design parameters that had come out of all of these interactions across the whole ecosystem. And it included a care for the workers' future. It included a question of safety. We had an enormously horrifying event in Massachusetts where 8,000 homes lost their gas from a mistake that resulted in the death of a young man and 71 simultaneous house fires. And we wanted a solution that got us to our climate goals. And we understood the risk of financial collapse, the question of a utility death spiral and stranded assets that we were creating as we dug gas pipe into the ground here in Massachusetts. And We also understood that the climate was changing, that we needed resilience, reliability, adaptability, and that we wanted an equitable transition, that if we took out the gas pipe and relied on individual business owners and homeowners to do a individual transition with, say, air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, that the cost currently was high, and that was a burden that couldn't be borne by the low income or most vulnerable. And so we began to design a solution that met each of these parameters. And the resulting proposal was what we call the GeoMicroDistrict. And that is that you take out a segment of aging, leaking, crumbling, I would say, gas pipe on a, say, branch or rung of that tree that Audrey described. So a segment that isn't relied on for other portions of the system. And you replace that with more pipe in the ground. In fact, the same pipe, HDPE plastic, and you put it in the same gas right of way in the street with the same company and the same workers. It's just that you put in a pipe that is moving water at the temperature of the ground, ambient temperature water, in a loop. And you connect that loop by service lines to each home or business and to an array of geothermal boreholes in the street. And the loop delivers an ambient temperature water to heat pumps in each building or customer, which then can pull off heat or cool as needed for that building. And the temperature of that water is maintained by 3 different energy sources. The first is simply a kind of energy sharing between buildings. So in many locations, some buildings are heating while some are cooling. And so that balancing of energy between them can cover a surprisingly high percentage of the energy needs. In one case study, 40% is covered by that energy sharing. And that
because
one is on
like
campus.
a VRF basically for instead of for a building, it's a VRF for an entire street.
The second source of energy is from the boreholes, and those boreholes, designed correctly, can provide what's called borehole thermal energy storage, basically taking the heat during the summer into the ground and returning it back to the customers in the winter, balancing that thermal energy needs over space and time. And with a utility managing it, the utility becomes a thermal energy management utility, providing that management over space and time. And the third source of energy is a backup, which in the beginning, in those first segments, would be most needed. But as you begin to install more and more segments interconnecting and backing the gas system up, you have more and more resilience and efficiency as one street's excess cooling can cover another street's excess heating needs. And you get a more and more efficient system as you grow it, which is a beautiful direction to go.
So yeah, instead of building more infrastructure that's going to be stranded assets, you build a more resilient system every section you add. One question though, you still are adding, at least in the early stages, I guess, in cases like in the middle of the winter, is there still supplemental heat required?
Yeah,
or is
our idea is as you grow an entire district, because each of these street segments interconnect like Lego blocks. So that as you grow out that entire district of district heating and cooling, then you can use biogas, which is sort of the level at which biogas can be used because we don't have enough of it to replace all of the fracked gas we have in our system currently.
I would answer that slightly differently. The piloting of this system will give us real data as to whether that backup is needed, but we of course are designing a supplemental backup heat into the system for the initial installations.
As a sort of security blanket for people.
Yeah, we do have a case study in a campus in Colorado with a similar temperature range where they have not fired their gas backup for 11 years. So we are optimistic that the backup is simply a security blanket.
And as an additional benefit, like air source heat pumps will get what's, a COP, a coefficient of performance of about 2, which means that for every 1 unit of energy you put into the system, you can actually move 2 units of heating or cooling into or out of a building, right? But a ground source heat pump will get more like a COP of around 4, so twice as good. And then, once you add that shared loop, that networked geothermal system to do that load canceling and sharing, then you're talking a COP of maybe 6 to 8. So that means that the electric grid is not going to be as strained from moving all of our buildings to electricity for heating. It will allow the transformation to this new clean economy to happen even faster.
I just want to add that once you've created this thermal grid, you have a whole different energy system. And the thermal grid itself can balance that electric grid, providing not just peak cutting and load leveling, but also thermal energy storage, which is one of the key challenges to going entirely renewable energy. So your wind energy at night that you don't have a use for can be dumped into the earth through this renewable thermal grid. And the earth is basically our cheapest long-term energy storage available. So by building this system, we've also created an enormous energy storage system.
Thermal energy storage, right?
Yes.
Because the electricity would be dumped in as as heat.
And the flexibility of a thermal grid is enormous with a utility management, because as our heating and cooling climates shift with climate change, which is an enormous challenge to any kind of energy system design, we can bring on to the grid thermal sources and sinks as needed. Even, doing fun and exciting things like dumping cool into a river that restores the temperature to its pre-climate change temperature, ensuring the trout survive, or other exciting, fun thermal energy management tactics that are just out of reach without this kind of thermal utility.
No, that's excellent. So we've done a lot of work on campuses looking at this, so I'm familiar with it. We did a podcast not too long ago, I think it's last fall, with Carleton College, where they've gone through this process. One of the challenges we run into, though, is this idea of you're essentially switching from paying for fuel to paying more for capital costs. And in this case, this is a little different because you're basically talking about avoiding the capital costs of building all of the pipeline, which is probably one of the more expensive pieces as you rip up streets and start putting the pipeline in. I imagine, though, that this system would also require putting all the equipment in at the buildings themselves. But you're talking about the utility company running this. So can you tell me a little more about the kind of the business model aspects of this? Because I think that's fairly brilliant of what you're talking about.
Yeah, this couldn't be better for a utility, because what utilities, how they function is they do very expensive upfront, infrastructure costs, and they get those costs paid back through energy bills over decades across all the customers. And that's one of the reasons why we all have gas and electricity and water. I mean, we don't all dig our own water wells, right? And in this way, the system can be regulated also to make sure that it's fair for everybody. But it spreads the costs out across all people rather than just having those with high income being able to move to a cleaner, safer fuel when they want.
Regarding campuses, the utility has built into its business model a desire to put in infrastructure, as Audrey said, and can therefore greatly reduce the cost to a campus by partnering in this kind of approach. And the utility could provide the thermal loops, thereby extending its customer base. The campus can simply invest in the heat pump infrastructure needed within the buildings to pull the temperature off. In, again, some initial case studies, campuses, and they're the perfect case study, of course, are having payback on a system like this, even with paying for the installed loop in less than 10 years. Because you've got these efficiencies you can't get any other way with the reduction of infrastructure needed by load sharing and load canceling, and with the reduction in electricity costs from the cooling, as well as water cost reductions from reduction of cooling tower use, which matters more in some locations than others, but the kind of system impact in terms of cost reduction appears to be quite large, and we can't wait to get more cases in and have kind of a consistent prediction.
Let me ask or make a comment on the cooling towers first. So just for listeners that may not be aware of how campus scale or even large buildings have for air conditioning, they're not running air units like you would have in your house. They have giant concrete bunker looking things, like something straight out of the Dharma Initiative, I always think, where they're running water down and it's evaporative cooling. So you're losing the heat out of the water as it evaporates, which means you lose a lot of water, right? And you're usually a lot of places are running potable water through those systems, which means you're cleaning this water up only to evaporate it to the sky so you can get rid of the heat. In some cases, people can use non-potable water. But so in this case, tell me how this works differently. I know, but I'll let you answer the question.
So you can provide cooling because you've for instance, during the winter, you've been sucking all the heat off of that shared loop of water, right, to heat all the buildings. And so you've taken all the cooling left over and stored it in the boreholes in the ground. And then when the summer hits and you need that cooling, you pull it out of the boreholes. You can use some cooling towers as needed, but you can do it if you need it at night when the temperature is cooler, thus making it a much more efficient process.
And then there's no water loss in the pipes, right? Because
there's no water loss in the pipes. And I would just point out that cooling by the type we usually install in our homes with a compressor electric or cooling by cooling tower, neither is as efficient a technology as a ground heat pump technology. And heat pump technology basically uses, 1 unit of electricity and produces multiple units of cooling energy. So by creating this system, you're providing the optimal system to keep the heat pumps most efficient. And in fact, one engineer says this shared loop makes the heat pumps happy, which I think is a lovely little idea. And so you get this optimal efficiency from heat pumps, and there's nothing more efficient than that.
Yeah, most, like the air will fluctuate enormously in temperature from -5 up to 105, whereas the ground is always the same temperature. And it's much closer. It's like, somewhere in the 50s. It's much closer to the temperature you want in your home. So it's way easier to pull the energy you need out, way more efficient.
And both heating and cooling, you're not going to freeze the ground or heat up the ground over time.
You create a balance. As much heating as you put in is the amount of cooling you take out.
That case study in Colorado I keep talking about, Carrie Smith of the Gray Edge Group built that over a decade ago. And about a year into our effort, we were really thrilled to discover this and have been collaborating with them since.
Okay, well, so tell me more about the actual pilot project you're working on now, because my understanding is you're doing this. You have real pipes in real ground and real houses hooked up to a real system. But what's the scale and what's that progression look like?
There are some initial installs that are very similar to this. The pilot that we're working on now is a pilot of having a utility do this in the street for diverse customers. And so Eversource Gas, that gas company we met with years ago and told them about our concern for our children, they have moved forward in a very bold move and proposed 3 pilots in Massachusetts to our Department of Public Utility. And we are in the middle of a rate case to determine whether they can bill this to ratepayers, whether a gas company can essentially pilot a transition off gas paid for by their customers. And so We have a list of potential sites. There's a lot of enthusiasm in Massachusetts from any number of different types of sites for these pilots. And we're also in conversation with a number of other utilities who are moving forward with pilots, including a pilot proposal in New York by Con Ed. National Grid is moving forward, and several others. So these are pilots of the technology, but also of the business model and process in terms of a utility, a public utility. However, we do have a few case studies, like I mentioned, on campuses that are giving us some really interesting data on the efficiency and the cost.
And the money savings, so not only do you get a huge reduction in emissions, but, as Zeyneb said earlier, you get paid your money back through energy and water savings really quickly.
Well, and so I just wanted to clarify then. So basically you're trying to get the Utility Public Service Commission to approve of the pilots at this point, because they're basically saying, hey, commission that regulates our behavior, we want to completely do something different than what you normally regulate. Can we do it? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Like they're changing what they're regulating at that point.
Yes, in a way, although we're making an argument that if you do have that gas backup heater on the system, maybe, a long way away, maybe only in the most dense urban area, then it is a gas system which is providing the energy through efficiency
right. Okay.
and through storage. So it's basically the same as a passive house, which if it is connected to gas and never uses the gas, is still a gas customer. We're making a passive system that would be connected to the gas and hopefully never use the gas. So that's one of the potential arguments.
And how is it going? I mean, it sounds like you've been through a couple of hearings, or how is it being received by the commission so far? Or is that something you can comment on?
It's really fascinating. The Attorney General's office has put forward a petition to require the Department of Public Utility to evaluate and plan for question of the future of gas utilities. There's been a number of presentations, partly from us and others, that have really raised this issue in Massachusetts to the point where it's on the minds of the department. And so the conversation happening within these hearings is, it would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, I think. And it's actually very hopeful. There's questions about customer base change over time, about electrification, about the installation of new gas pipe, and whether this can deliver a solution, whether this pilot can deliver a solution for the challenges we face. And I think there's an enormous amount of openness. I don't think there's been anyone against the pilot yet from any direction, but simply a very reasonable questioning of cost and process, which we welcome.
Sure. One of the questions I wanted to get at that we get a lot in our campus work is this just sort of strategic direction of, should we connect all our buildings and put pipes in the ground and pay the money for a new district energy system, or should we isolate each building and make it super efficient with its own solar panels and its own kind of living building approach, which basically means each building is its own standalone island. It sounds like you guys are on this network approach, based on the conversation we've had. But the other element to that is there's this idea of like getting off of gas and electrifying, which typically means switching utility companies in a lot of places. Like I know here in Seattle, we've got Puget Sound Energy, which is a investor-owned regulated utility. And then we have Seattle City Light, which is a municipal-owned utility. So they're not really the same company. They have different incentives. So it's, they don't really want to be poaching each other's customers, or they have kind of de facto rules to keep that from happening. But
right.
How have you sort of bridged that gap?
I would say, first of all, to the passive house effort for an individual building and the wonderful living building approach versus a networked campus, I would say yes, and
Sure.
there are enormous benefits to be gained by reducing the load and demands of any one building, and the health impacts are huge too, to something like the living building challenge. And a networked approach like we're proposing it increases the opportunity and efficiency and the resilience of the campus by really not just increasing efficiency, but also allowing the energy sharing between buildings. So when your dorm is operating, but you're at maximum demand and your classrooms are not, you have the efficiency of covering the thermal energy needs of the classrooms by storing the energy used from the dorm. For example, on this Colorado Mesa, you get a 40% efficiency gain that you can't get any other way by interconnecting your different buildings with their different load profiles. And there's a load canceling and also a load sharing. And then if you make each building more efficient, like with the living building, you need less infrastructure in the ground to do that.
So that your hockey rink is basically providing, by sucking all the cooling, is providing the heating you need for your chemistry labs or your residences, etc. And, there's this in Colorado Mesa University, which is the one we're talking about. There's also Weber State University and many others. You can actually look at the temperature in the pipes on the control panel and see that some of the buildings are taking heat at the same moment that others are taking cooling. And that for a majority, like during the shoulder months, the boreholes are not even part of the loop. They're just, moving energy around to each of the buildings.
Great. Well, I know that there's the study you did with the engineering firm Burl Habel, which I enjoyed reading through, and I'll be sure to put the links in the show notes for that. And I think that does a pretty good job of kind of conceptually explaining this as well.
Great.
So, but kind of as we're wrapping up here, I guess a couple of questions to wrap up. One would be, what does 5 years from now look like for you guys, or 10 years from now? I mean, you can pick your time frame, but give us a little glimpse of the future.
I'm the optimist. So I think there's an exciting new business model for the gas utility industry that spreads like wildfire. Maybe fire isn't a good analogy.
Like a shared loop of energy.
Right. And there is a redirection of investment from gas system replacement and repair to the creation of this renewable thermal grid, and it is growing. Maybe in tranches or segments, we're transitioning the infrastructure while retraining workers and allowing that drive, that business system drive, to provide the transition building by building that we have needed for so long, with energy efficiency, of course. And my hope is that perhaps in this very challenging situation we find ourselves in the world today, that we begin to shift the way we see our interdependency, and that a stimulus effort that I would assume we're going to need in the coming years could be directed towards this kind of creation of the infrastructure we need for the next century, and that we can move quickly enough with our pilots to have the data and information needed to drive that transition.
And my hope is simply that the children of today aren't horrified by what we adults have not managed to get done for their future.
Well said. Well said. Well, I guess one logistical final question and then kind of a wrap up would be, if people want to get in touch with you, they can go to the HEET website. How should they get in touch with you?
HEETMA.org, HEETMA.org has all the information that we've been talking about, and you can email info@heetma.org.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed watching this story unfold since that sleepy lunch presentation or post-lunch presentation in 2017. So I'm really amazed at how you attacked this intractable problem, and you basically have turned your likely adversary, which the gas companies, into your allies and are helping them see a path forward. Because I really like that. It's not just about opposing things. It's a lot about showing a path out of the wilderness, which I think you're really doing, which is super inspiring. Especially in these crazy times we find ourselves in. I think the world needs more change management of that kind to really get to where we need to get to go.
We all have kids, and we're all in this together.
Absolutely. Yeah. So any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Thank you for sharing this story. I hope it gives other people hope in the way it is continuing to give me hope.
Yes, and I hope that many campuses understand how this makes economic sense and will be attractive to their students and will help the planet.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to keeping in touch with you all as we work on the campus side of this problem and joining forces to change the world. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Kelsey Harding for her production assistance. You can find show notes, transcripts, and contact details for our guests on our website at campusenergypodcast.com. If you'd like to follow our show on social media, our Twitter handle is @EnergyPodcast. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching for Campus Energy and Sustainability Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on iTunes or just sending a link to a friend. As always, thanks for listening.